Los Angeles has always been a city built on promises, sunshine, stardom, reinvention. The idea that anyone can become someone if they're beautiful enough, hopeful enough, or willing to disappear into the crowd. But in January of 1947, that illusion broke apart in a vacant lot. The newspapers gave her a name, the Black Dahlia. It sounded glamorous, mysterious, almost like something out of a movie. But behind that nickname was a real person, Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old, unmarried, broke, and drifting through a city that quietly chewed up people like her every day. She didn't vanish, she didn't disappear, she was left behind. Her body had been mutilated with surgical precision, drained of blood, cut, posed, and displayed. The killer didn't try to hide what he'd done, he staged it. And in doing that, he created one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. This story isn't just about a killer who was never caught. It's about Hollywood before it learned how to protect its image, about media, obsession, and spectacle, and about how a young woman became immortal only after she was destroyed. Let's begin.
Before she became a headline, Elizabeth Short was just another young woman trying to outrun her past. She was born in 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Her childhood wasn't stable. Her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression and was believed to be dead until he suddenly resurfaced years later in California. Elizabeth struggled with asthma, and doctors told her a warmer climate might help, so she headed west. Los Angeles promised reinvention, but Hollywood rarely gives people what it sells them. Elizabeth moved constantly. She stayed with friends, acquaintances, sometimes people she barely knew. She worked when she could, waitressing, occasionally modeling. She talked about acting, but there's no real evidence she ever landed serious roles. People who knew her described her as polite, quiet, careful. But that's not how the press would later describe her. After her death, newspapers painted her as reckless and immoral, because that version of Elizabeth sold more copies. By the end of 1946, she was essentially homeless, drifting between hotels and couches. On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth Short was last seen alive. 6 days later, she would be found.
On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman was walking with her young daughter through a vacant lot in Leimert Park when she noticed something strange. At first, she thought it was a mannequin. It wasn't. Elizabeth Short's body had been severed cleanly at the waist. There was no blood. She had been carefully posed. When police arrived, the details only became more disturbing. Her mouth had been cut into what's known as a Glasgow grin. There were signs she'd been restrained, bruising, and cuts so precise they suggested anatomical knowledge. There was no blood anywhere at the scene, which meant she had been killed somewhere else. Her body had been washed, cleaned, and then placed where it would be seen. This wasn't a crime of panic, it was deliberate. And within hours, the media arrived. Photographs were taken. Details, some accurate, many exaggerated, were printed across the country. Elizabeth Short stopped being a person. She became a spectacle.
The LAPD launched one of the largest investigations it had ever conducted. Hundreds of people were questioned. Doctors, actors, bartenders, former lovers, even people who just happened to live nearby. Confessions poured in, most of them false. The killer sent letters to newspapers, clippings, Elizabeth's personal belongings. He wanted attention. But the investigation struggled almost immediately. Crime scenes weren't properly secured. The press interfered constantly. Internal politics slowed everything down. Evidence was mishandled. Leads went nowhere. And as weeks turned into months, outrage replaced hope. No arrest was ever made.
Once it became clear there would be no easy answers, theories rushed in to fill the silence. So let's talk through the ones that actually matter. Not the most dramatic, but the ones grounded in evidence. First, the basics. Elizabeth Short wasn't killed where she was found. Her body was washed. The cuts were clean and precise. That strongly suggests the killer had anatomical knowledge, possibly a doctor, possibly someone trained in surgery or mortuary work. This doesn't give us a name, but it tells us the killer wasn't random. Which brings us to George Hodel. Decades later, suspicion focused on Dr. George Hodel, a physician, a socialite, and a man many people found deeply unsettling. What makes this theory stand out is that it was pushed by his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD homicide detective. George Hodel had medical training. He lived near areas Elizabeth had been seen, and in 1950, police secretly bugged his home because they suspected him. During that surveillance, Hodel made comments that raised eyebrows, including one infamous line suggesting that even if he had killed the Black Dahlia, no one could prove it. That's not a confession, but it's also not nothing. Still, there was never enough evidence to charge him. Another theory is that the crime was personal, that Elizabeth was targeted by someone who fixated on her, an admirer, a rejected suitor, someone who stopped seeing her as a person at all. The brutality suggests rage, but the control suggests planning, and that combination is what makes this case so unsettling. What we know for sure is this: Elizabeth Short was murdered somewhere else. Her body was transported, the crime was staged, and whoever did this was never held accountable. The Black Dahlia case doesn't endure just because it's unsolved. It endures because of what it shows us about Hollywood, about media, about how easily someone can be reduced to a headline. Elizabeth Short didn't become famous for how she lived. She became famous for how she died. And the mystery surrounding her death has never really been about answers. It's about discomfort, about knowing that sometimes there is no closure, no reveal, no justice, just a young woman, a city that looked away, and silence that followed. And maybe the most unsettling question of all is this: if this happened today, would anything really be different? Thank you for watching.